With 52 women already killed this year and the stress on the community and the struggle to change the culture of ignorance when it comes to domestic violence, do you intend to implement any more of the recommendations from the Domestic and Family Violence Task Force? And if so, how effective will they be, given that the Queensland budget only allocated $31.3 million over 4 years to domestic violence?
Thanks, Casey. That's a very good question. It was actually an issue that was discussed at the COAG meeting last week, and I do commend the fact that the Prime Minister's put it on the agenda, the table, for a national campaign, which I think is very important. But here in Queensland, we had a landmark report where Quentin Bryce handed down her report into domestic violence and the actions we can take. We've put in $31 million. That's a great first step. We're actually leading compared to other states. We're putting on extra duty lawyers to help women. Our first ever trial of a specialist domestic violence court down at Southport. And if that works out well there, I can see that rolling out to other parts of Queensland, and perhaps it can be adopted at a national level. Rosie Batty personally raised that issue with me when I met with her. We want to make it easier for people to go through the court system and not get lost. And we also want to make sure that we have more centres for help and extra support for the DV Help Service. So I think we are leading the way when it comes to the rest of Australia. Of course, more can be done.
Just quickly,
it is
though,
unacceptable and we must do more.
140 recommendations from Quentin Bryce's
Yes.
report. How many of those will you implement?
Well, we're going through it now for our government response, but
Do you imagine
all of them
it'll be the
seem...
majority?
Yeah, I do actually, because most of them are quite reasonable. And Quentin Bryce went around Queensland and listened to first-hand stories of people, and you don't get anything more real than listening to women tell their stories about having to flee domestic violence, the impact on their children. And let's face it, you can never escape it. It's always going to be with you through the rest of your life. But as a government, we are taking it very seriously, and I believe that at a national level it's being taken seriously. And Rosie Batty is being very outspoken and passionate, and people are finally taking notice. But we also need to look at education as well. We need to change culture and change attitudes, and that starts in the school. It is about respect and it's about equality. It is about treating women equally at that early age. And if we can start doing that, as I said last week, we can change attitudes, we can change culture, and we can change our nation.
Mark Coleridge, what's the Church's response to this?
Well, the Church's response is first of all, that it can't be just left to government. Again, it strikes me as a very Aussie thing to say, the government's got to do something about domestic... Of course you do, but this is a community responsibility, including the churches. One of the appalling things about domestic violence is just how hidden it's been. It was one of those things that, like the abuse of the young, that went on behind closed doors. And there was a cone of silence over it. It was, happened in the family home, let it be. Well, those days are gone, because what we are coming to see is that this is a widespread problem right throughout the community, and it's going to take the whole community, including the churches. Now, we have our big social welfare agency called Centrecare. They've been dealing with the reality for a long time, but in a way that hasn't drawn focus. Well, that's changing now.
Archbishop, can I jump in there? Because it's interesting that you mentioned the issue of abuse, because I was raised Catholic and in a very, strong Catholic parish. And it seems to me that the issue, like clerical sexual abuse of children, that the issue of family violence was one that perhaps the priests also turned a blind eye to, didn't speak up on, and perhaps that was another issue where they could have spoken out but didn't speak out.
Yeah.
Is that something you think that the Church needs to reflect on, and needs to wonder about the role that it played?
I think the Church certainly needs to reflect upon it. I'm not sure how much was... I just don't know. I really don't know. But the Church has to reflect upon it. And if they were turning a blind eye, it was following suit with the whole society, which has for a very long time known that this has gone on and has turned a blind eye. What's happened now, thank God, is that those days are over, that the locked door is no longer locked. The voices are no longer silent, but it has to be a responsibility that government, churches and individuals like everybody in this room now have to play their part in doing something about domestic violence, because it corrupts in the deepest possible way. All violence is shocking, but it's at its worst when it's in a home which is supposed to be a haven of safety.
So just on that score, and just before I move on, it really is the case now, isn't it, for those of us who were raised in a religious environment, that the nature of that privacy, the secrecy of that seal between priest and parishioner, that's broken for all time now, isn't it? As a priest, you have don't you see that you have a greater moral obligation to the truth and to broader society than to that private seal?
Yeah, absolutely, that responsibility. But there's still a sacred bond between priest and people. Now, I could talk at great length about that. But if you're referring to the seal of the confessional, are you? That's non-negotiable. Because at that point, what's going on is something between that person, the penitent, and God.
And when that person walks into the confessional and she has a black eye, what then?
I would... pastoral good sense would say, I'll talk to her afterwards and see what needs to be done.
And Tiernan, can I ask you to come in on this? This is a subject for all of us and for every Australian.
Look, I was very encouraged by the COAG leaders meeting last week. I'm very encouraged by the fact that leaders heard directly from Rosie Batty, who I think all of us agree has just done an extraordinary job to turn that shocking tragedy into a movement where people are really paying attention. I think the Premier, the one person in Australia who watched the press conference all the way through to see what premiers were saying on this issue, and I think the issue of behaviour and culture was a point very well made, Premier, when you did that, because I think this is right. Attitudes towards women are formed very early, and they're probably formed before school. And the way we treat each other is a fundamental issue, and I think we all do have a responsibility. I think she's done a terrific job in bringing that to leaders' attention. Of course, the challenge is always sustaining that issue attention, and because it's not the first time these kinds of issues have happened. How do we sustain leaders' attention beyond the current cohort who will have been so affected?